A new terror born in death. A new superstition entering the unassailable fortress of forever. I am legend. Today, this is a part of All Reading Counts. We're doing All Reading Counts novellas. We had some options. The people voted. They want to hear us talk about I Am Legend. So it is the ideal novella. Some say the perfect novella. Probably, at least one person. I'm TJ Blackwell. I'm here with the one and only, the beautiful Andy Walsh. How are you doing today?
I am doing well, thank you for that kind introduction. How are you, TJ?
I'm good as well. Yeah, thanks for asking. So what's the last literature that you consumed? What form was that in?
Well, I mean, I literally just finished reading this book a day ago, so probably that.
I love asking that question for these because usually it's like this. Like I was getting ready to record this. I just read this.
I mean, I read a couple of comic books on Marvel Unlimited.
Yeah, that counts. That counts as
Sure.
reading.
Yeah.
Yeah. For me, it was actually I read I Am Legend, and then just because like I had the tab open already, I was like, man, I should read some Ray Bradbury stories while I'm like in the realm. So short story for me, but if you're listening, please rate, review the show. It means the world to us. It is the easiest, best way to help us out. It boosts us in the algorithm. It's awesome. It's awesome. And we want to give a special shout out to Jeannie Mattingly for supporting us with her wallet. That means just as much and helps a little bit more just because it helps us, pay to record and stuff. So thank you, Jeannie. We love you, Jeannie. And you can get your own shout out if you would, support the show for $5 a month on Fourth Wall. You can take a look at our merch. You can leave a one-time gift. Check it out. Fourth Wall's great. You can get our All Reading Counts merch if you're watching this. Andy's wearing it right now. He's got like the nice forest green or emerald green. I don't remember the name of the green, but it's a really nice shirt. They're pretty comfy. I love them. I wear comfort color shirts all the time. And if you do go support us, any merch that is All Reading Counts, bonus questions, donations, even marked All Reading Counts, they go to supporting local libraries. So if that's something you're passionate about, there's a way you can, get two birds with one stone there. So if it's your first time listening to one of these, when we say All Reading Counts, what we mean is if you are consuming literature in some way, shape, or form, any way, shape, or form, that counts as reading. And we started this because people tend to be a little critical of the audiobook enjoyer. We think that's ridiculous. If I read War and Peace and Andy listened to War and Peace, the only real difference is going to be that my eyes are going to be a lot more tired at the end of it. So that's really what we mean. And we really are proponents of literacy. Illiteracy rates are climbing in our country across the board. And reading, I find to be super beneficial. It helps me center myself. I am, like, as a younger guy, it's pretty easy for me to just put the book down, not pick it back up. So, like, forcing myself to pick up a book and finish it actually has helped me focus a lot more on other things, that kind of thing. Any brain-rotted listeners out there, read a short story to completion. It'll help, I promise. So, today we're talking about why it counts to read novellas, and we are specifically covering I Am Legend because it is legendary. It might be the most adapted novella of all time. I didn't know that before we started, planning this episode. It's 3, technically, sort of 4 movie adaptations of this one novella. The one you're most familiar with is probably Will Smith's I Am Legend from 2007, which allegedly has a sequel in the works. I don't know if you knew that, Andy, but they are allegedly working on I Am Legend 2, which could be really interesting. I don't know.
I think that has popped up in my awareness at some point, yes.
Yeah. So I kind of can't wait to see what that is. But before we get into I Am Legend, we're going to talk about a novella. So novella, typically, as described by the American Science and Fiction Literature What is their final title? Something like that. One of the organizations that determines these types of things says a novella is in between 17,000 and 40,000 words. Typically, if it's 250 words a page, that's going to be 60 to 170 pages. So we're sitting right there at a solid like 27-ish thousand words for I Am Legend. We're right in the sweet spot as far as I'm concerned. It is weird if you go pick up a copy of I Am Legend. Or if you want to, you know what? Hey, so what, Andy, what happened to you when we said, yeah, let's read I Am Legend?
Well, I just wanted to make sure I was reading the same thing that everybody else was, because one of our mutual friends pointed out that there were different editions with very different lengths, and so I didn't want to read something that was only half of the story, or read a whole bunch of things, read something that was longer, and then be talking about stuff that everybody else is going, well, what is, that's not in the story, that you're making things up. And so I want to make sure I was reading the right thing, and didn't get a definitive answer on how to tell what I was looking for. So I finally just went to the library and discovered that there are print editions of I Am Legend that are titled I Am Legend, but when you open them up, they are in fact I Am Legend and Other Stories, which is also the title of a volume that you can purchase. But apparently somewhere along the line, somebody went, people don't buy something with and other stories in the title. They will buy it if it is just called I Am Legend. They want to buy the book that goes with the movie that they saw with Will Smith in it. And so they put Will Smith on the cover of this book. They called it I Am Legend. And then to make you feel like you're getting your money's worth, and to make it, 300 some odd pages long instead of 170 pages long, they put, I think it's 8 other short stories by Matheson as well in the back there. And so, you can look at it as bonus reading. You can look at it as X pages that made this book, copy of I Am Legend more expensive than it needed to be. You can look at it however you feel the need to. But it turns out there's really only one version of the text. It is just packaged in very different ways.
Yeah, because I didn't know how to answer that question. I was like, I have no clue. I read most things. I read online these days. I just look it up, and if I have to buy it, I buy it, and then I just read it. It's so I had no clue. But that's just the kind of thing that happens when you're trying to read a short story by an author from like 70 years ago. I feel like no one wants to pay for, 90, 60, 40 pages of story. So they just bundle it in with a bunch of other things. I think it's fun. I think, it's nice to end up with some extra stuff to read. I like that. Because instead of finishing the book and then thinking, man, what do I do now? You just keep going. So personally, I'm a fan. But, Andy, do you have any previous history with Robert Matheson, and what previously was your exposure to I Am Legend?
As you can probably guess, I had not read the book previously, and that's why I had such basic questions about how to obtain it. But yeah, I was aware of the book and aware of the story, but I had not read it. I have not seen any of the adaptations that have been mentioned. So I came into this completely, well, not completely cold, just from living in the world. I knew a few things about the story because having heard people talk about the movie. So I was not completely unaware of it. And I've obviously interacted with things that derive from it or that were influenced from it, right? Mm-hmm. And so to me, it kind of falls into that hole that, what was the name of that movie? The John Carter of Mars film fell into a few years ago, where everybody who knows such things or as a student of such things goes, oh, John Carter of Mars, very influential science fiction novel from many years ago. But when you see it in 2012 or whatever it was that movie came out, you go, well, this feels like a ripoff of Star Wars and Dune and all these other things that, or actually heavily influenced by it. And so, yeah, it's a little bit tricky coming to I Am Legend in the same fashion. It's hard to appreciate what I gather to be fairly original features of it, because it has so strongly influenced most zombie and vampire things that have come since.
Yeah, it is really interesting going back to, just a 1954 novella, and you're like, oh, is this where that started? Cool. And if you want to talk about range, Edgar Rice Burroughs writing Tarzan and John Carter of Mars. Sure, it's crazy. That's insane. That's a real author. But do you want to? Can you summarize I Am Legend for us really quick, and then we'll start breaking it down and dissecting Robert Neville and the literature as a whole.
Sure. How spoilery are we comfortable
Oh,
being with a 70-year-old novella?
it is. It is 71 years old. If you didn't read it or watch any of the movies at this point, you lost your chance if you're gonna listen.
Yeah, but sympathy for me because I was a newbie as of 3 days ago. So yeah, I Am Legend is the story of Robert Neville, the apparently last human, last living. The nomenclature is a little bit tricky. Survivor on Earth of a bacterial infection that has turned people into vampires. And so he lives alone in his house, which he has fortified to keep out the vampires. And his daily routine is just by day maintaining his house, finding food, maintaining all the things that he needs to keep going, his car and so forth. And by night, waiting out a vampire, not exactly assault, but just sort of vampire taunting and so forth out in the streets. And yeah, that just kind of goes on day after day. And so part of the story is just kind of giving you the flavor of the bleakness of what it would be like to be the only person who has survived this infection and not become a vampire, what he's been, and over the course of the story, you get flashbacks to what he went through to get to that point, right? When the story starts, he's already in that last known survivor position. But, we learn about his wife, his daughter, his neighbors and so forth over the course of the story, and flashback to all the challenging, traumatic, and gut-wrenching things that he went through to be in that position. We see what it takes on a day-to-day basis for him to just kind of survive under those conditions. And then over time, he conducts a fairly detailed scientific investigation to try to understand what it is that happened. So that's how we know that it was a bacterial infection. And that feels to me like, and perhaps because of my bias, that feels to me like the heart of what got Matheson motivated to write this story, just because he spends so much detail on it, is trying to start with, okay, let's say that there are actually vampires in the real world of 1954 or thereabouts. What would actually that look like? How would that actually be caused? How could we explain that? And so, it takes all of the quote unquote classic vampire traits, right? Being afraid of garlic, being killed, the only susceptible to the stake to the heart, not tolerating reflections, all these kinds of things, being able to turn into a bat, and kind of explores, first of all, just which of these things actually are true and which one they're not. So for example, he pretty much tosses out the notion that they can turn into bats. And then which of these things could be explained by this bacterial infection, which of these things are psychological and so forth. So there's several lengthy passages in which he kind of explores how to explain away these different vampiric phenomena.
Mhm.
And then as he's conducting this investigation, he has some different encounters with a couple of different notable vampire characters. And by the end of the story, the bacterial infection has shifted, and the infected human's relationship to it has shifted such that they are a bit more in control of their own choices, and they are starting to form their own society, in which he realizes that he is viewed as the sort of mythical monster who has gone around killing these vampires when they're trying to create their own society. I guess I left out that bit that he spends a big part of his days also is just going around and staking vampires where they sleep, so that he doesn't have to deal with them in the night. And yeah, so thereby we get the title I Am Legend, because he realizes that he has passed out of he's become the legend, the myth, the monster, and to this newly emerging society.
Yeah, so I was reading it and I got to the final passage, this most recent time. I've read it once before, like years ago, just because I was looking for something to read. But this most recent time, I got to the end, and I thought, like, thought to myself, like, wow, how subversive. And I was like, no, actually, I don't think that's not subversive. He's like the first person to do it. Like there wasn't anything to subvert at the time, you know. But it is really interesting. I love it when an author just goes super, super in depth on something that the story's just not about. Like it really does feel like sometimes that Matheson wanted to write a medical journal instead of a vampire novel. I'll get like the same vibe. Have you ever read The Road by Cormac McCarthy or Blood
No.
Meridian? Blood Meridian. So much of Blood Meridian is just like incredibly vivid descriptions of the area, like mesas in Arizona. It's beautiful language, and then the rest of it is atrocities, just genuinely awful things happening to good people. But you get those nice little parts where he describes how beautifully the sun sets and how the animals treat the world. I love it when authors do that. But some of it, I love reading old literature too, because this is 1954. He talks about his car, his Willis station wagon, because there weren't Jeeps yet. It was Willis. I love that. That's so fun. And you have a unique perspective because Robert Neville does get into like immunology and microbiology. He kind of gets driven into that state where he needs to know more about the vampires. Like you said, he starts dissecting what is real, what is myth. And at this point in 1954, it's awesome. He's like here to deconstruct the vampire myth before it really even gets started in pop culture. Which is not to say, Dracula and Nosferatu weren't around already. Even Neville quotes Dracula, the book, in I Am Legend. But it's cool. He'll like kidnap a vampire that he knows was not Christian to see if a cross, affects them at all. And it doesn't. As he's researching the vampires, he gets, he starts going through his memories, and he remembers a vampire tried to climb a light pole and fly onto his roof by flapping his wings. And that's because the vampire thought he could turn into a bat because they too were susceptible to the myth of the vampire. Super
Right.
interesting to read.
Yeah, I mean, he winds up. It is interesting because, and the character is basically described as frustrated by this, but he's trying to explain so many of these vampire traits in terms of, well, there must be something about the bacterial infection itself that is giving rise to this, and then he winds up, and I don't know if this is Matheson kind of throwing up his hands and going, I tried and I couldn't figure out an explanation, or if he, this is where he wanted to wind up with it, but it's fairly late in the day when he goes, oh, actually, most of this has nothing to do with this infection. It's not necessary. It's just a psychosomatic feature of we were raised on vampire literature, and so this is what we expect vampires to be like, and so these people start behaving that way. They're afraid of the cross or whatever other religious symbol because they were brought up in their religion to be afraid of becoming a vampire, be afraid of demons and so forth. And so the knowledge that they are now a demon means that they are damned. And so they're reacting that way because of the psychology of it. The mirror thing is, that they're afraid of what they become, or they find what they become distasteful and so forth. Yeah, it was certainly an interesting take on such things. It does kind of beg the question of, well, then where did the vampire legend, where did these elements of the vampire legend come from? Because we're also meant to believe or understand that all the stories about vampires, the folklore of vampires, came from actual people with this infection, and that for whatever reason it was a rare infection in the past that has now become a global pandemic. Apologies for using that word, but so that's that's not really explaining what changed to make it much more infectious. But yeah, like what? So why did those things enter into the vampire folklore in the first place if it was always this bacterial infection that did not necessarily cause these elements? But there's only so much you can push on that. But yeah, it was interesting to see how much of it was just kind of tossed under the heading of, well, this is what people think. This is how people think vampires should be. So when you become a vampire, that's what you do.
Yeah. So they do actually, he like alludes to what makes it become, more communicable or at least more widespread. But it's like one sentence. You just have to catch it. It's one sentence where he realizes why it happened. And then in a flashback, he mentions why the dust storms happen. So the dust storms are just present. And it's, we're made to believe that the dust storms are just a couple times a week all over the world. Dust storms. Sure. Because of the war, which in 1954, we assume is World War II. That's it. The dust storms carry the germ, make it more communicable, make more people get it. He says that in, I think, literally one sentence out of this entire book.
Yeah, you're right. And I think I just didn't buy that. And so that's why it didn't stick.
Yeah. Yeah. So it is still 1954. Science is not quite as advanced as, they thought it was, which is always the case. But it's cool. So we skipped it. 0 out of 10, or I guess 1 to 10. Please don't give it a 0. What do you think about I Am Legend?
I would probably put it like a 6 or a 7. There was more microbiology than I expected, which was pleasing to encounter. It's not my usual thing, vampire zombie kind of stuff, but it's a well told story, and it had, like I said, more details in it than I expected that captured my interest. So yeah,
I was also pleasantly surprised. I'd give it like a solid 8. I think it's a fun read. I think it's a cool thing to read. I like reading old stuff. I like reading old science fiction. I think it's a good time. And I think Robert Neville is a very interesting character. I feel like I can't speak to this because I was not alive in the 50s. My dad wasn't alive in the 50s. I feel like he was supposed to be relatable in some ways. At least he is a caricature of what some people would think of when they think a 1950s man, even though the story takes place in the 70s. But he, developing alcoholic, book is weirdly horny. I feel like we should cover that. He spends a lot of the first 30, 40 odd pages talking about how the female vampires try to lure him outside with their bodies and how it's driving him crazy. So I'm glad he grows out of that. There is some growth in the book. There is some growth. But you said you haven't seen any of the movies.
correct.
None of them. Not even the Will Smith one.
Not even the Will Smith one. Like I said, vampire zombies never really been my thing, so didn't have a lot of selling points.
Wow. Okay. Well, I'll cover them quickly. I have unfortunately not seen Last Man on Earth or The Omega Man. I know Last Man on Earth is Charlton Heston, classic horror. I need to check it out. The Omega Man, I think, is really interesting, especially for the time. Last Man on Earth came out in 1964. Omega Man came out in 1971. And I like that, back then, the 60s, 70s, they weren't directing the story one-to-one, so they weren't going to name it one-to-one, even though from what I've read, they're much closer to the book than Will Smith's I Am Legend. And then in 2007, they were just like, yeah, no, we're calling it I Am Legend. We want people to read it. And it's got basically no similarities at all to the novella. So that's interesting. That's interesting. Also, stylistically, they have a lot of differences, and we're not here to talk about the movies, but I just think it's cool that there are 3 of them. And I do really like the Will Smith movie. And the only thing and I don't believe the other two do, that Will Smith's I Am Legend does, is end in suicide. Spoiler warning. Once again, that is how the book ends. He takes some pills given to him by a sympathetic vampire who doesn't want to see him be like beheaded or like bled out or whatever they have planned for him. So she slips him the little cocktail and it helps him go out that way. But I think it's super interesting just looking at the different styles that we have portraying the story. I think it's a good story. I do. I might be an I Am Legend lover. Also, very interesting on the points that they focus on. So in the book, we know that Robert Neville is not a scientist. He was a soldier, then he worked at a plant. His dad was a scientist. I think all three movies actually just skip straight to him being a scientist, where in the novella, we actually see him grow into being a scientist out of almost necessity because he gets tired of, finding a new lathe. I thought it was cool to see Sears, like, on his little to-do list he writes for himself. One day he's like, lathe at Sears, get a new lathe. He's running out of dowels to make steaks to drive through their hearts. And then one day it just clicks. He's like, maybe I don't actually have to do that. Maybe I don't have to do that. And I think it's also funny because the whole time he had guns. And one of the things that the bacteria actually is responsible for is making sure that guns do not work. I think that's super interesting.
That was such a Mr. Han, Enter the Dragon. We're just not having guns. Just nope.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like, nope, guns don't work. They don't work. You can use them, but they just don't work.
Yeah.
They do work on people in early stages of infection, I think it was.
Yeah, I was a little fuzzy on, because there are parallel concepts of there are living people who are infected, who are vampires, but then also the dead become infected and come back to life as vampires, but also they died from the infection, right? Like his wife, Virginia, is someone who got infected, got sick from this bacterial infection, died from it, and then came back to life as an undead vampire.
Yeah.
So I don't understand how it was unclear to me why that wasn't what happened to everyone, how there were some people that were still alive but also infected and also vampires, and that seemed to be a difference, right? That seemed to matter in terms of whether you could succumb to a bullet wound, how you responded to being staked. It seemed to be a significant difference, but I didn't quite get why some people managed to be alive.
Yeah.
For years, not just for days, but for years and years. And that the society that forms is of these living vampires. They're the ones who are able to sort of regain their mental faculties. But yeah, why they were infected for so long but not dead, I don't think was really explained.
Yeah, so do you think it would be better if it weren't a novella and we kind of got into why that is? Like, explain the hierarchy to us?
I mean, far be it for me to, second guess a highly successful story that, has influenced numerous other writers and filmmakers and so forth. But if I'm being asked to give editorial notes, I think my note would be, instead of expanding the story to go into that detail, I would say just drop that detail and pick a lane. Either they are all undead vampires, or they are all living vampires, or however you want to describe it. But I'm not sure that enough is made plot-wise or story-wise or theme-wise from that distinction that it's worth sticking around. And so I would I think the story works well for its simplicity, for its brevity, for its, like, I'm going to get straight to the meat of things. And so I think it would benefit more to just continue to hone it down to its bare essentials rather than trying to give it, expand it out in the modern tendency to just give everything a 12 issue, or 12 episode prequel
Right.
motivation.
Yeah, I feel like it almost purely serves to throw Robert Neville off course. Like, it's a red herring. It doesn't actually matter. It just makes him susceptible to the vampire spy named Ruth. I think if they had all been dead, he wouldn't have fallen for that.
Yeah, and and there's also a case we made that it's texture that adds an interesting wrinkle to the story, and that's fine. If I wouldn't insist on that note, but if I was being asked my opinion, which direction to go with that's I think I would just simplify things rather than trying to complicate them more.
I think it is interesting when he decided to put in and not. So at the end of his 3-year, stay in his home, his 3-year survival, he is accosted constantly every night by his former neighbor, Ben Cortman. And there's once where he gets Ben Cortman into his home and doesn't kill him. At that point, he reveals that he is a little sympathetic for these vampires because they didn't choose to be monsters. And then they push it even further when the new society of living vampires comes to get him. They kill Ben Cortman. And he's distraught because he's been listening to Ben Cortman call his name for 3 years. And he's like watching from in his house, begging him to survive. I thought that was really interesting and just shows growth in Robert. Like, I think that really, other than the vampires, that really might be what it's about, is what a man can go through, what he can grow through.
Yeah, I mean, yes. What it takes to survive, what that does to you, what those circumstances force you to renegotiate. Yeah, I mean, that's clearly what the story is actually about, not the microbiology of vampirism.
Yeah, but it is cool. It is cool. Watching Robert Neville learn how to use a microscope was very relatable. It's really annoying to use a good microscope for the first time. It's good. I like it a lot. It's really good. That's what I have to say. What else? There are some things that are unrealistic. He still has food. He sells like frozen food and stuff. Like, he runs a generator.
But there is some evolution there, right? Of he's starting out with, he's just kind of has the supplies of everybody that was around him, right? The first part of the book is like 3 months or 6 months in, and so he's still kind of living off of what he was able to raid from other people. And so frozen food, and it goes into some length into what he's doing to keep his generator going and so forth, why he still has electricity. Is it entirely realistic? Maybe not. I don't know. But, where is he getting the gasoline to power the generator? At some point, that's going to run out.
Yeah.
All these things. Cool. Yeah, there's definitely everything's on a ticking clock, just at different rates, right? But everything is going to run out because he does not have the ability to continue to produce these things.
Yep.
But it did seem like at some point he shifts to, at some point it talks about the food less, but there does seem to be some acknowledgement of, everything, the only things that would be left would be canned foods or things that he could have somehow grown after a while.
Which he seems to have no problem growing garlic.
Yes, he's an amazing gardener if all you want is garlic.
Yeah, if you really like garlic, that's your man, because he can, and it's all he does.
Right.
No onions, no other alliums even. It's just garlic.
Nope, just garlic.
No chives, just garlic.
Yep. He tried the other ones. They didn't work.
Yeah, they didn't do anything to vampires. Why would he grow them?
That is one of the few things that is biochemical, not just psychological, the revulsion to garlic.
Yeah, which it's so cool. I just think it's really interesting what he decided to go with there. And I wish we could prove it wrong. But I do really feel like it would have served better to be at least twice as long. Like it could have been just barely not a novella. And I think that would have served it wonderfully. Just so we could get a little bit more of that depth, I feel like him showing compassion for Ben Cortman and just shows to us that he could have blended in with this new society. He really could have. And I think it would have been interesting to see what that was like. But once again, it was too late for him because he had been, during their night, he had been going into their homes and killing them. And he only got better at doing it. He got more efficient. He didn't have to lay the dowels to go kill 45 of them a day while they sleep. He just found out he could just cut their wrist. Anything to stop he calls it body glue that makes them bulletproof. Anything to stop that from forming, that works. That's why stakes worked. Body glue just couldn't form around them.
Yeah, I'm still unclear as to why a bullet didn't have the same effect, but okay.
That one was him. That one was Matheson being like, oh no, guns would make this too easy. You got to figure something out.
Yeah.
Because, Dracula, they didn't have to worry about that.
Yep.
They didn't have to worry about that. But is there anything else you want to mention about the story before we start to wrap up?
Well, I did think so. It turns out that 1954 is a pretty notable time in the history of molecular biology, right? So 1953 is the year when Watson and Crick and Rosalind Franklin are able to resolve the structure, the 3D structure of DNA, the famous double helix that we now see everywhere. And it was only 1952 was the famous Hershey-Chase series of experiments that proved to the satisfaction of pretty much most of the biology community at that point that DNA was the material of inheritance. When we talk about our genes and what we get from our parents, that it was DNA that's carrying that. For the previous 60-ish years, maybe longer than that, maybe 70 or 80 years, DNA, we knew what the sort of biochemical makeup of cells were. We knew that DNA was a thing that was present in all cells, but most biologists were persuaded that DNA was too simple to be the genetic material and that it was proteins that were actually what was responsible for inheritable traits. Or was the thing that got passed down from parent to child. And so, yeah, it was only in 1952. There were some experiments in the 1940s that strongly suggested that DNA was the genetic material, but folks were still skeptical. And so, yeah, it was 1952 Hershey-Chase experiments that involved radioactively labeling bacteriophages, which make an appearance in the book. Radioactively labeling bacteriophages, which are basically just protein-coded DNA and nothing else. And so they labeled the proteins with one radioactive isotope, radioactive sulfur, and the DNA with radioactive phosphorus in separate bits. So some of the viruses had radioactive sulfur, some of them had radioactive phosphorus, and infected bacteria, and found that what went inside of the bacteria to cause the infection was the phosphorus labeled DNA, and that the sulfur labeled protein all stayed on the outside of the bacteria. And so that was the thing that finally convinced people. So it's interesting to read in the book. He talks about talks about bacteriophage. They seems to be a little bit confused as to what they are, because he talks about it just sort of being protein, when in fact they are viruses that infect bacteria, and so they have both DNA and protein. But yeah, so he's kind of right at the cusp, and he, the results of the Chase-Hershey experiments may not have reached the general public by 1953 or 4. I'm not exactly sure when he wrote the story versus when it was published. So not a criticism, but it's just kind of interesting that like he's kind of right in some ways, right on the cutting edge of molecular biology of the day by writing about bacteriophages and some of these different issues, but. Yeah. It's also, as a historical note, it's kind of interesting that the Hershey-Chase kind of got lucky in their choice of model system, because bacteriophages, or the bacteriophages they were using, inject their DNA into the interior of the bacterial cell. But that's not how all viruses work. A lot of viruses, actually the whole thing, protein and nucleic acid in total, get taken up by the cell that they're infecting, and then they separate inside the cell and replicate. And so if they'd used a different virus model, they would have actually gotten inconclusive results, and it might have taken even longer to figure out what that DNA was what our genes were made out of. But it worked out in their favor. So that's an interesting little anecdote. But yeah, so it just kind of it's cool to think about for how much detail there is in the biology of the story. A lot of that was fairly contemporary science, and other elements. Most of what we know about germ theory and bacteria and so forth, was a product of the previous 50 years of biology. So still fairly recent developments.
Yeah, I think there's one point where he had just gotten into his scientific streak where he admonishes germ theory. He's like, "Oh, of course they were right. Oh, of course germs are real. That's why we're in this mess." I thought that was really funny.
Yeah.
But that's what makes this a science fiction novella instead of just a horror novella, because at the time, this is the cutting edge. This is real science. These days, my eyes would probably bounce off of this on a page. But he was in it. He was in the cut, as the kids would say. But I think that's it for us for I Am Legend. Let us know if you want us to specifically review any of the 3 movies. We will. I'm down to rewatch all of them. Andy is not a vampire fan, so we can exclude him if he doesn't want to. But I'll do it. And as for our supporters, they get an extra question. And that question is going to be, if you were in this situation, is there a specific person's house or business that you would want to hole yourself up in? We're going to answer that after we finish. So, do you have a recommendation for somebody that isn't a novella? Something to read that's not a novella.
Sure. So I'm going to bang a drum that I've banged before, but the book that this most put me in mind of was Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, which also has a lot of microbiology at its center, and will also be adapted into a forthcoming movie. This coming March, I believe, is the release date now, with Ryan Gosling, directed by Lorda Miller. So I've been very excited about that movie. That was the movie I was most looking forward to this year, until I found out that it wasn't actually coming out this year. But they filmed it last year. They could have put it out this year.
They could have. They didn't do it just to make you upset.
Well, there were a lot of movies that had come out this year because of the strikes and all the previous years. So I understand the business of these things a little bit. But yeah, but it's a really good book in its own right. Also has some interesting microbiology, some real microbiology, and some science fiction microbiology as well, and some other cool things. So yeah, that is the book that comes to mind that as something I would recommend off the back of this. If you liked I Am Legend, give that a try.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, similar vein, way more science fiction-y, way less vampire-y. We're aliens and spaceships here, but To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, Christopher Paolini's flagship sci-fi novel, his first one. I think it's really interesting. It gives some really, it's more of a xenobiology kind of point of view for a good bit of that book, and I think it's super interesting. I think he knocks it out of the park. I love that book. I can't wait for the rest of the series. I'm seated when he releases it. Check it out. I think it's phenomenal. But if you're listening, hope you enjoyed it. We love having you guys here. As always, please remember, rate and review the show wherever you rate and review shows. Big shout out to Amber Riley for supporting us financially. We couldn't do it without you. But all purchases of the All Reading Counts merch, bonus questions, or donations marked All Reading Counts will go to supporting local libraries. Typically, it is like one of our local libraries. But if you have a library in mind that you just want us to donate to on your behalf, we can do that. Include it in a donation. Let us know. DM us, email us, whatever you want to do. Remember, don't yuck someone's yum. We are Systematic Geekology. We like to systematically geek out on things together. So, be friendly, be happy, have fun, and we'll see you next time.